Hi, it's me, your friendly neighborhood madwoman in an attic, here to talk to you about Gothic literature. Is this good? Spooky? Gothic? I'm gonna set my hair on fire. September was the foundations month in my personal curriculum on Gothic literature, which means I've spent the last month reading a couple of early examples of the Gothic novel and even earlier texts that are considered to have been influences on the Gothic novel, and some scholarship to help me get more context on the Gothic novel. Here is a list of everything I read in September, whether in full or in part, whether for the first time or for review. The Castle of Otranto, written by Horace Walpole, published 1764. The Monk, written by Matthew Lewis, published 1796. Mysteries of Udolpho, written by Anne Radcliffe, published 1794. Northanger Abbey, written by Jane Austen in the 1790s, but not published until 1817. Edmund Burke's A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origins of Our Idea of the Sublime and the Beautiful, 1756. Anne Radcliffe, again, On the Supernatural in Poetry, written in the early 1800s but not published until 1826. Sigmund Freud, The Uncanny, published 1919. Also bits and pieces of scholarship on the following subjects: portraits in Gothic novels, the Marquis de Sade in the Gothic, the Eco-Gothic, and Gothic horror. Also Hamlet, Macbeth, and Paradise Lost. Now let's talk about all of it. First up, Castle of Otranto, Horace Walpole, 1764, considered to be the first Gothic novel. In this novel, the family that inhabits the titular castle is living under a curse as a result of their ancestor having deposed the true, rightful ruler of Otranto, and we get a series of supernatural events, including a picture crawling out of its frame, a robed skeleton issuing a dire warning, and a giant helmet falling out of the sky and squishing somebody to death, all of which make clear that doom and destruction are at hand until order is restored and the true ruler is reinstated to the castle. I then read Matthew Lewis's The Monk, which is about, among other things, a monk who was left at a monastery when he was a very young child and since then has never left the monastery walls. And because he has lived his entire life up through where he is now in his 30s, in this spiritual isolation, he is considered to be totally pure and incorruptible. And he's something of a local celebrity in Madrid. People come from far and wide just to hear him preach and to hear his wisdom. But it turns out that his lifelong lack of exposure to any form of temptation actually means that he has no self-control when he is faced with temptation. Kind of like me, who grew up in a house with no high fructose corn syrup, and then when I went to college, ate cake for every meal from the dining hall. Except in his case, rather than eating cake, it is engaging in increasingly licentious sexual acts and eventually escalating into pretty horrific sexual violence. So not like me at all, actually. Also, this novel has a pregnant nun, a Beauty and the Beast style magic mirror, and Lucifer. Lucifer is also there. And those, like I said, are considered to be early examples of the Gothic novel and ones that were extremely popular in their time. I also reviewed another late 18th century Gothic bestseller, this one that I had read before, Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho. This novel follows the character Emily St. Aubert, who after gradually losing every member of her immediate family is placed into the dubious care of her aunt, and then eventually her aunt's cruel, controlling husband, Signor Montoni. During much of this novel, Emily is living in the titular Castle of Udolpho, where she is being plagued by all these sinister threats that seem to be supernatural, and also by good old-fashioned harassment from men. In contrast to the other two, which really do have ghosts and monsters and devils and supernatural elements in them, Mysteries of Udolpho and all of Radcliffe's other novels are part of a category of what is called the explained supernatural, which probably is self-explanatory, but means that over the course of the novel, there are many things that seem to be supernatural in nature, but at the end are explained to have rational causes. One thing that all three of these 18th century Gothic novels have in common is a focus on virtuous young woman, a young girl, a teenager really, who is extremely pious and deferential to her paternal figures. Very modest, very sweet, and very concerned with living life correctly. In Otranto, we have Matilda, who does her best to respect and obey her tyrannical father Manfred, despite Manfred's attempts to first ignore her and then to marry her off to a man who is her father's age. In The Monk, we have actually multiple virtuous young women because there are multiple plot lines, because a lot happens in this novel. But I would say that the emblematic Gothic heroine in this novel is the young Antonia, who is so sheltered from any temptation or sin that she even reads a censored version of the Bible that has had all of the more bawdy and scandalous passages removed from it. And in Udolpho, of course, we have Emily, who has simply never done anything wrong in her life. In all honesty, I don't really love Mysteries of Udolpho. It's like 1,000 pages of Emily St. Aubert being perfect and doing nothing wrong ever, despite being continually beset by hardships and horrors, until eventually she is rewarded for her virtue and gets everything she wants at the end. That character type just feels very antiquated to me, and is an outdated character type, but is kind of like an earlier evolutionary stage to the types of heroines in novels who I do find really compelling and do enjoy reading. And I appreciate that this character type of the Gothic heroine, the Matildas and Antonias and Emilys, are placed in contrast against tyrannical and often predatory men. So these novels are directing our attentions and our sympathies towards how wrong it is for these men to try to force young women into unwanted marriages, or to attempt to control their finances, or to harass them or assault them, or just in general to use their own social, political, financial power against these young women who are in, of course, a very constrained position in 18th century society. The Monk is definitely the most extreme version I read this past month of that virtuous young woman, predatory older man dynamic, because the titular monk Ambrosio is violently obsessed with Antonia, and he assaults her multiple times until eventually kidnapping her and murdering her. And then he finds out that she was his sister. And this is presented obviously as an act of great evil, and Ambrosio meets with an appropriately horrific fate at the end of the novel. The Ambrosio-Antonia storyline is presenting us with this very extreme version of the narrative of a bad man controlling an innocent woman's life and body. He is an extreme version of evil, and she is an extreme version of virtue. But I was surprised to see that this book also showed some degrees of virtue, that it presented multiple versions of a narrative in which a young woman's body and life are controlled wrongfully. In addition to Antonia, the perfect Gothic heroine who suffers horribly, we had another character named Agnes, who is also virtuous, also lovely, also a young woman of great moral character, but who has consensual sex and faces terrible consequences as a result of it, and is controlled by the systems and individuals around her in a way that the book is directly critiquing. Agnes is in love with a young man. He is in love with her. They want to marry each other, but they are continually interrupted by these external forces trying to push their relationship apart. And ultimately, even though it's not what she wants to do, she joins a convent and takes her vows and becomes a nun. But it's not what she wants, and while she is in the nunnery, she has sex with the man who she wanted to marry, and she becomes pregnant as a result. She is trapped in this nunnery, pregnant, unable to escape, and when her condition is revealed to those around her, she is psychologically and physically tortured, basically. Her storyline had some true horror to it and some true tragedy. While in prison, she does lose her baby. And so we have in this novel both Antonia and Agnes subjected to these controls and these curtailings of their agency and these horrible torments. And they are treated as similarly worthy young women, despite the fact that one of them is so pure that she reads a censored Bible and one of them has had sex outside of marriage. I have read a lot of early modern and long 18th century narratives that have kind of trained me into expecting that the narrative consequence for sex outside of marriage is death. But Agnes doesn't die. She suffers horrible torment and horrible tragedy, but she is rescued, and ultimately at the end she gets to marry the man she loves and they can live a full life together. Going into reading The Monk, I didn't know any of the details of the plot, but I did know that it was going to involve sex and violence, and so I was really braced for it to remind me of the writings of the Marquis de Sade, who was writing around the same time, 1790s, early 1800s. And if you don't know, Marquis de Sade is the guy from whose name we get the word sadistic. And it turns out the Marquis de Sade was a big fan of The Monk, so my fears weren't totally off base. I read about a decade ago de Sade's novel Justine, which is about a virtuous young woman who is enslaved, abused, and assaulted from the ages of 12 until she is 26 when she dies of a lightning strike. And not for this personal curriculum or for any other reason will I read that book again or anything else by the Marquis de Sade again. I didn't like it. But because I was a little bit curious about the potential connections between de Sade and the Monk, or de Sade and the Gothic in general, I did read a book chapter of scholarship discussing de Sade in the context of the Gothic. In this chapter, the author Maria Vara suggests that Justine, the novel, shows the title characters, quote, stubborn and meaningless adherence to virtue, contrary to what takes place in the classical Gothic, which presents a heroine who is finally compensated in the narrative for her good conduct. The manic attempt of de Sade to expose his heroine to all the possible dangers and sexual acts that Radcliffe texts frequently suggest but never actually portray can be read as an ultra-Gothic structure that parodies the whole ideology of the Enlightenment. And I'm sure if I had the stomach for it, I could do a study of de Sade's writings in connection with the Gothic and compare these two models of heroines or of female characters and think about how sexuality is functioning in de Sade and in the Radcliffean Gothic. I'm not going to do that, but I do appreciate this critical perspective. And I can see how the Sadean heroine is kind of a critical caricature of the more classic Gothic heroine. And as I was kind of getting at earlier, I understand the urge to critique or to parody the Gothic heroine. But far more to my taste in terms of parody is Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey, which is another one of the texts that I reviewed this past month. I love Northanger Abbey. It's in my top 3 for Austen novels. It's one of the earlier novels that she wrote, but it wasn't published until after her death. It begins with the line, "No one who had ever seen Catherine Morland in her infancy would have supposed her to have been born an heroine." This could never be a heroine. Catherine Morland isn't a Gothic heroine. She wasn't tragically orphaned at a young age. She hasn't been beset by any kind of tragedy. She's not very good at drawing. She doesn't really care that much about singing. She's never been moved to tears by poetry or the sound of the wind in the leaves. She's just an ordinary young woman, and like many ordinary young women in the 1790s, she is obsessed with Gothic novels. She cannot get enough of reading them, and the more terrifying and horrible they are, the more she loves them. Throughout this entire novel, Jane Austen is poking fun at Gothic novels and Gothic heroines, but she's doing it so fondly and so protectively, and with so much care and respect towards the women who write and read these novels. Around halfway through the novel, Catherine gets invited to go stay at the home of her new friend Eleanor Tilney, with whose brother, Henry Tilney, she is falling in love. And it turns out that the Tilney home is an abbey, Northanger Abbey. And because Catherine is obsessed with these novels that are always taking place in faraway, dramatic castles and manors and ruins, this just absolutely sends her imagination into overdrive, and she more and more starts imagining that she has found herself in the plot of a Gothic novel. And her imagination is constantly comically leading her astray. You know, she imagines that this house is full of mysteries and secrets and dark elements, but it's just a weird, drafty old house. And she imagines that the Tilney's father is harboring a dark and terrible secret, but he's just kind of an ordinary asshole. And she thinks that in the night she has found a scrap of paper that surely contains some secret, long-lost narrative of a woman who is trapped. It's just like a laundry list or something. And at the end, of course, she gets to marry the man she loves, Henry Tilney, who, in my opinion, is one of the heartthrobbiest of all Austen heartthrobs, because the thing that makes your heart throb about this man is that he also loves Gothic novels, despite the fact that they have a reputation for being feminine, and he doesn't devalue the novels or the people who love them. And in this, he is contrasted against one of the most unbearable men in Austen, John Thorpe. John Thorpe has no time for novels. He always has something more important to do. He would never waste his time reading a novel, although he did recently read The Monk, and he thought that was quite good, but that was the only one he's read recently that he thought was good. He would certainly never read Udolpho. Udolpho would be a waste of time. He would only read a novel written by Mrs. Radcliffe. Her novels are quite good. You say that Mrs. Radcliffe is the author of Udolpho? Look at my horse. It's a little John Thorpe impersonation for you. Anyway, in this book, there is a real focus on the public perceptions around Gothic novels and the fact that Gothic novels were both extremely popular but also very widely devalued. There's even a section where Jane Austen is talking to us directly about novels and the popularity of trashing novels, even within novels. She's just mentioned that her two female characters are spending time together reading and discussing novels, and she says to the reader basically, oh, maybe this surprises you that I'm defending novels, but she says, quote, I will not adopt that ungenerous and impolitic custom so common with novel writers of degrading by their contemptuous censure the very performances to the number of which they are themselves adding, joining with their greatest enemies in bestowing the harshest epithets on such works, and scarcely ever permitting them to be read by their own heroine, who, if she accidentally takes up a novel, is sure to turn over its insipid pages with disgust. Alas, if the heroine of one novel be not patronized by the heroine of another, from whom can she expect protection and regard? I am no novel reader. I seldom look into novels. Do not imagine that I often read novels. It is very well for a novel. Such is the common cant. And what are you reading, miss? Oh, it's only a novel, replies the young lady, while she lays down her book with affected indifference or momentary shame. It is only Cecilia, or Camilla, or Belinda, or in short, only some work in which the greatest powers of the mind are displayed, in which the most thorough knowledge of human nature, the happiest delineation of its varieties, the liveliest effusions of wit and humor are conveyed to the world in the best chosen language. I just love that passage so much. And when you combine that part with the section where Austen is poking fun at this unbearable, stupid guy who is putting Anne Radcliffe as the sole worthwhile novelist, what you end up with is actually this really interesting thing where Austen is criticizing the bias and really the misogyny that she herself would eventually be subjected to in her legacy. Because this isn't just something that John Thorpe does. Mr. Thorpe is reflective of a general attitude at this time to uphold Anne Radcliffe as the one great novelist. She was even compared to Shakespeare by some of her contemporaries. She was a bestseller and she was highly critically acclaimed. And for a long, long time, it was very common to see Jane Austen upheld as the one great female novelist, that she was the one girl allowed into the all-male canon of great English writers. This is a little bit of a digression, but here is a book that I have been flipping through intermittently over the past few months, Jane Austen's Bookshelf by Rebecca Romney, who is a rare book dealer and collector. This book is basically a documentation of Romney's efforts to familiarize herself with the women writers who were influences on Jane Austen, one of whom was, of course, Anne Radcliffe. In her chapter on Radcliffe, Romney draws attention to the really singular position that Anne Radcliffe held in the estimation of her peers and especially of her male peers and critics. She says, quote, just before he condemned all women who wrote Gothics, the same writer who called Gothic by women literary prostitution also admitted that his love of the genre was caught from an enthusiastic admiration of Udolpho's unrivaled foundress. In her lifetime, Radcliffe was always the exception. Remember, she was poetical. Critics hailed traits in her work that were similar to her male peers in order to distance Radcliffe, whom they liked, from the scribbling women following her in the Gothic genre, whom they didn't. She goes on to say that there comes a time when every not like the others girl learns that being more like the boys doesn't, in fact, save you. How true. Radcliffe has not maintained that position of supremacy in the general estimation. She is no longer compared to Shakespeare. If you ask 50 people to name some of the greatest English writers of all time, I doubt that Radcliffe would be mentioned once. I don't have the context or the experience to make an argument or even really a hypothesis as to why these Gothic novels that were literary blockbusters of their times and why these authors who were upheld as generational geniuses by their peers have now faded from public attention. But I can quote from one critical discussion I was reading earlier this month that talked about something related to this in a way that really made sense to me and that I have been coming back to in my notes and in my thoughts over the course of my September reading. Early in the month, when I was doing just a general search for any scholarship related to the Gothic that I could add to my digital archive and come back to over the course of the semester, I found this one dissertation, actually, from 1994, titled The Return of the Repressed, Gothic Horror from the Castle of Otranto to Alien. And anything that combines classic lit with contemporary pop culture is absolutely irresistible to me. So I spent some time scanning through it, not reading it closely, just browsing. The discussion of Alien was very brief, but it was interesting. You know, what if we think about the 1979 movie as a kind of Gothic interpretation where the spaceship is standing in for the castle and where Ellen Ripley is a kind of a take on the Gothic heroine. She is this morally upright woman whose choices are being curtailed by the men around her going against what she wants. And there's this monstrous threat lurking behind every corner. Anyway, there's one part of the introduction where the author is talking a bit about how quickly Gothic horror ages out of being scary and kind of how rapidly a novel can feel antiquated. He says, quote, "The historical specificity of Gothic tales helps to explain why their power to shock readers tends to weaken over time, despite the evident consistency in narrative movement and in certain recurring images and themes. What is dreadful to one generation of Gothic readers does not remain dreadful to the next, because there is a continual historical alteration in the precise characteristics of what is being repressed. The threshold separating the admissible and the inadmissible is a constantly shifting cultural ground because psychic readjustment, individually and collectively, is an ongoing process." The idea that these novels so quickly phase out of popularity and don't hit the same after a short amount of time because of their historical specificity makes a lot of sense to me. That felt right. Although, of course, in this passage, the author isn't talking about just popularity, isn't just reasoning, why was Anne Radcliffe so popular once, but now she no longer is? Why was The Monk a bestseller once, but now it's rarely mentioned? This passage is really more about fear and about why horror so quickly ceases to be scary for new audiences. Speaking of fear, let's talk about some of the critical theory I read this month. We're talking terror, horror, and the Sublime. For my reading on this, I had to crack into this old brick of a book on critical theory that I bought as an undergrad, and I don't think I've touched since I was studying for the GRE, sitting at my shitty kitchen table, eating hot and sour soup, caked in egg wash from my job at the bakery, and trying to desperately retain any of the critical theory contained within this volume before passing out and going to sleep and then waking up at 2 o'clock in the morning to do it all over again. Good times. I knew that the idea of the Sublime was really influential to a lot of Gothic writers, and particularly Edmund Burke's philosophical inquiry into the origins of our ideas of the sublime and the beautiful, and so I decided to brush up on my Burke. When danger or pain press too nearly, they are incapable of giving any delight and are simply terrible. But at certain distances and with certain modifications, they may be, and they are, delightful, as we every day experience. This is not very good, Brandy. Basically, what comes out of Burke's comparison between the beautiful and the sublime is the idea that what is beautiful might give us some superficial, temporary pleasure. It might be nice. But what is sublime, what is rooted in fear and greatness and overpowering something that is even close to pain, that inspires in us a more profound sensation and a more productive and meaningful experience. A rolling field of green under blue skies and fluffy clouds is beautiful and brings us a sense of pleasure, but a rocky mountain or lightning and thunder or tempestuous threatening seas or an expanse of desolate ice, these are things that are sublime, that engender in us a sense of fear and awe and awareness of our own smallness. And that sublimity and that thrill, that terror, is more profound and therefore to be valued higher. And this actually brings me back to Anne Radcliffe, but this time not to one of her novels, but rather to her theorizing around the sensation of terror, and specifically the distinction between terror and horror. I say this isn't one of her novels. It is actually an excerpt from a novel she wrote that was never published. And this excerpt was published after she died as an essay titled On the Supernatural in Poetry. The supernatural in poetry, what are we describing? My AO3 browsing history in the year 2013? In this excerpt, Radcliffe is distinguishing between horror, which she identifies as a kind of sudden fear, like being spooked, and terror, which is linked with the sublime and which is more lasting, more solemn, more profound. And in one section of this essay that was very interesting to me, she uses as illustration for the differences between horror and terror the ghosts of Macbeth versus Hamlet. Her argument is that the ghost of Macbeth is rooted in horror, a more superficial fear, whereas the ghost in Hamlet is linked to terror in part because of the other sensations that are connected with the reveal of the ghost, the cold and the dark, and also because of the expectation building up in Act 1, Scene 1 while we are waiting to see whether the ghost is going to present itself. And she connects these things, the dark and the cold and the expectation, to Burke's idea of the obscure, as in that which is not fully visible, that which is wholly or partially hidden. In her discussion, in her little Shakespearean analysis section, Radcliffe says, quote, "The union of grandeur and obscurity, which Mr. Burke describes as a sort of tranquility tinged with terror, and which causes the sublime, is to be found only in Hamlet, or in scenes where circumstances of the same kind prevail." Even though I personally love Macbeth more than Hamlet, I did, as I was reviewing these scenes, find myself agreeing with Anne Radcliffe that there's just something really successful and really eerie about the presentation of the ghost in Hamlet, more so than in Macbeth. You know, the play opens in the dark and the cold, and the men are standing watch and they're discussing this eerie thing that's been happening the past couple nights, and we're wondering whether the ghost is going to show up tonight. And then Horatio enters and he's skeptical, so we get to be skeptical alongside him. And then the ghost does appear just after the stroke of midnight, and they try to talk to him, but he won't respond and he's just drifting around sinisterly. It's good shit. It's very spooky. I had already assigned myself Hamlet and Macbeth and Paradise Lost, which also comes up quite a bit in these discussions of sublime and terror, for my September personal curriculum reading, because I knew that these three early modern texts are considered to have been influences on the early Gothic novels. And I definitely could see that even just reading through these three 18th century Gothic novels that I read this month. I didn't read Paradise Lost, Hamlet, and Macbeth in full this month, but I did review them and try to focus on the sections where there were really strong elements of the supernatural. So in Paradise Lost, I looked closely at books 1 and 2, where we get introduced to Satan and hell and the devils and death and sin. And then in Hamlet and Macbeth, I focused on passages that feature the ghosts, or in Macbeth's case, also the witches. With both of these plays and with Paradise Lost, I was trying as much as possible to read with fresh eyes. It's very easy to take something like Hamlet for granted because Hamlet is so ubiquitous. It's become this cultural touchstone where even if you've never read Hamlet, you know quotes from Hamlet and you know elements of the plot of Hamlet. And I've personally spent so much time reading these texts and writing about them and discussing them and researching them. And so they can feel kind of familiar, almost to the point of being mundane or just second nature, you know, like it's my house that I live in and that I can navigate even with the lights off because I just know where everything is. And consequently, I don't really look around at myself with fresh eyes and really take notice of things as often anymore. But by challenging myself to look at these texts with fresh eyes, and because I was thinking about them in a new context, in the context of the Gothic, rather than how I've previously worked with them, which is in my work in just early modern English literature, I was able to experience them in a slightly different way than I have before, and to slow down and really appreciate the language and the suspense and the supernatural thrill of it all. The guiding principle and the motivation for doing this personal curriculum from the beginning was that I wanted to take some of my academic training and background and apply it to a reading project that was just for me, just personal, just driven by curiosity and research for its own sake, and talking here with other people, not in a formal way, not with any kind of deadlines or output or expectations attached, but just because it's something I love and it's a field that I have a fair amount of background in. And I thought that I would get this sense of curiosity and discovery mostly from the texts I'm reading for the first time, but it was a very fun, very welcome surprise to find that I can get some of that experience of investigation and curiosity as an end to itself, and fresh perspectives even from texts that I have been reading for almost half of my life. Speaking of my guiding principles for this personal curriculum, I'm going to work my way towards starting to wrap up by talking a bit about the research questions I set for myself when I was writing my curriculum, and kind of how I've been thinking about those over the past month. I set these questions for myself as a way partly just to articulate what I was curious about at the beginning of my semester-long reading project, but also to hopefully give myself some guidance throughout that I could come back to. My 4 questions were, very briefly, what are the defining elements of Gothic lit and how do they shift over time? How do contemporary writers reinterpret what the Gothic is? How do gender and sexuality factor into the genre, especially given the high prevalence of female writers and readers throughout the genre's history? And how are the house and the tradition of hospitality featured across Gothic lit? Right now, it feels like that question of gender and sexuality has really been giving me the most to think about, with, the virtuous heroines and the predatory men, the emphasis on sex, and even the emphasis on these physical thrills of horror. And then when it comes to the topic of hospitality in the home, so far it feels like what I'm seeing is very much a continuation of the kinds of things that I was used to seeing in my work on hospitality in early modern English drama. This idea that the home is meant to be this place of security, and that when you enter into somebody's home, you're entering into a social contract with them, that the vulnerability you are sharing by being in close proximity is meant to protect you mutually from harm from each other. And so when there is harm that occurs within hospitality, or when the home, which is supposed to be safe and secure and comforting, becomes either under threat or threatening in itself, this is a deeply unsettling thing, and something that really violates a lot of social and cultural expectations. One of the critical texts that I ended up reading this month that I hadn't actually assigned myself in my curriculum, but that I kind of landed on after some research tangents, was Freud's essay, The Uncanny, which I have read before. I don't think that you can get through a master's degree in English without reading The Uncanny at least once. And so going into my reread of it, I did already know that the German word for uncanny, unheimlich, literally translates to unhomely. And that is something that had kind of popped up in my thoughts and my conversations around hospitality before, but that I've never really done anything with. It never led to anything productive when I had workshopped the idea of the uncanny as the unhomely before. But it's feeling more interesting to me now, and something that I can kind of latch onto a bit more and maybe more productively engage with in the context of the Gothic and horror and these differentiations between types of fear. Freud describes the uncanny as, quote, that species of the frightening that goes back to what was once well known and had long been familiar. So it's this idea that in order for something to be uncanny, it must once have been familiar and comfortable. That there needs to have been something homely that is now turned unhomely through some sort of subversion or interruption or warping. As I move forward through my Gothic curriculum, I think that this is something that I'm going to be holding in mind in regards to the elements of horror and the supernatural, and in my kind of ongoing questioning of how the home and hospitality are factoring into these novels. I definitely have a fun time ahead of me in terms of horror and types of fear as I go into October, which is my month for 19th century Gothic novels. And that means Dracula and Frankenstein and Dorian Gray. It's going to be a month full of thinking about monstrosity and otherness, and of women writers, Mary Shelley, the Brontes. At the beginning of this video, I called myself a mad woman in an attic, which is partly just a joke I like to make about myself because I do live in an attic apartment. But it's also, of course, a reference to Jane Eyre, which features famously a mad woman in an attic, and to this book, The Mad Woman in the Attic, which is a book of 1970s feminist criticism. This book is very famous largely because it was really the first push at establishing a female literary tradition and kind of interrupting the all-male literary canon. And speaking of the home and hospitality, in the introduction to this book, Gilbert and Gubar, the writers, say the following, quote, "Enclosed in the architecture of an overwhelmingly male-dominated society, these literary women were also inevitably trapped in the specifically literary constructs of what Gertrude Stein was to call patriarchal poetry. For not only did a 19th century woman writer have to inhabit ancestral mansions or cottages owned and built by men, she was also constricted and restricted by the palaces of art and houses of fiction male writers authored." That is something that I am planning to spend some more time thinking about in October. I also have this one stray thought kind of bumping around the blank expanse of my brain, like one of those old screensavers, just floating in the expanse and bumping off the walls, and the little thought dot just goes, Gothic Taylor Swift. So maybe that's also something I'll be thinking about in October. Who knows? Until next time, I will continue to be here in my attic, descending deeper and deeper into madness. It's growing on me a little bit.